All right, so welcome back, Social 10. This is our first lesson, or our first video on Lesson 2. And the purpose of Lesson 2 is to begin to explore the connection between globalization and identity. And it can be an intimidating lesson because there's a lot of language, a lot of vocabulary that we're going to throw at you. But as I throw the language, the vocabulary at you, I want to make sure you understand why I'm throwing it at you and how you might be tested on it. What I don't want you to do is memorize the definitions with the idea that maybe in the future you're going to need to write the definitions out word for word and you're going to get docked marks if you don't have the exact phrasing down. That's not how you'll be tested. What you'll need to be able to do is to understand the definitions of these terms, the meanings of these terms, so that you can look within sources for them. So we just finished an activity where you're generally looking at sources, and that's difficult because you don't have all the language down yet. You don't know what to look for. So after looking at this, you'll be better prepared to do what I call an A1, a source interpretation. So what words are we looking at? Well, we're trying to look at the impact between globalization and identity, globalization and culture. So logically, we begin now with the idea of what is identity? Well, that's simply how we see ourselves and how others see us. That's my identity. So maybe I identify as Irish, but maybe you don't see me as Irish. Maybe I identify as an elite athlete, and maybe you don't see me as an elite athlete. Maybe I identify as a comedian and you don't see that either. Maybe you see a fool where I see a genius. So there are different identities, right? But maybe the most important is, what do you see when you think of yourself? Now, the message of this course is that because we connect with others, our identity can change. As I globalize, my understanding of self can change. I'm not living in isolation. So maybe I thought I was an elite athlete. Maybe I thought that in terms of the weight room, I'm more than above average. And then I see Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who's roughly my age, and I'm like, wow, I'm nowhere close to The Rock. So that makes me reevaluate my identity. Maybe I don't identify as, I'm a weightlifter first. I'm addicted to iron. Maybe he's addicted to iron, and I just sample it once in a while. Now, I've already talked about cultural globalization, and with cultural globalization, we have a chance to look at traditions. What are the traditions of the McBride family, the McBride tribe, the McBride clan, and what are some traditions I'd like to add to them? So what are traditions? They're ideas and beliefs and practices that are passed from generation to generation. And the sad thing, as an Irish Canadian, is that many of my Irish traditions have been lost because of globalization. Because we connect with others, I don't really know many Irish traditions. I've been absorbed. I've been assimilated. My culture has been lost, and it needs to be revitalized. To the extent that I'm adding Danish traditions, and I don't even know some Irish traditions I should be doing. So that's something to think about too when we think about identity and link it to traditions. What are the traditions associated with your identity? Language is one that we should take very personally. Language is a key cornerstone of a culture. That when you lose a language, you lose a culture. We are teaching Cree at Wetaskiwin Composite High School because it's critical for Cree people to speak their language. There are words in Cree that cannot translate to English or French or any other language. So if you tell Cree stories in English, you lose something in the translation. Same thing with Irish or Gaelic. I can't speak my language, I speak English, and because I speak English instead of my native tongue, much of my connection to my past, that great chain of being that I'm a part of, it's been severed because I can't look at historical, Irish and Gaelic and Celtic stories and read them in their original context. I read what is an English spinning of them. And if you know anything of Irish history, we don't necessarily like the English. So if they are the ones rewriting my stories, probably the messages have been compromised. So key to globalization and cultural globalization is language. Can you protect your language when you connect with others? We're now living in a village where most are speaking, English or Chinese, and hardly anyone speaking, my ancestral language or maybe yours. And that makes it very vulnerable for you to lose your language and to lose your culture. Religion. Religion is a system of faith and worship. And religion, too, is something that when you meet others, religion can spread. Or religion can be compromised, right? Maybe religion is something that is growing because of globalization. But some religions aren't. Some religions are dying. So another part of globalization and identity and culture is this exchange of religion, of spirituality, of a greater purpose, of why are we here and how are we here and what happens after we're no longer here. Where do we go next? Is there a next? And as we connect with others, sometimes what has historically been the religion of your people, you might be like, yeah, you know what? That's not me. And enough of your people say that's not me, then that part of who your people are is lost in the great chain of being. So that's religion and spirituality, and you could add to that ideological beliefs, a study of ideas. So as we encounter others, we encounter new ideas, and that's exciting. But I don't know about you. My mind is limited. There's only so many ideas that I can have in there. So if I put in a little bit of socialism, a little bit of communism, a little bit of whatever, then some of my other ideas might be lost to the recesses of my mind. So how many ideas can coexist? And sometimes new ideas may challenge old ones, and that could lead to growth, but it could also lead to the end of some of your historic collective or individual identities. We have clothing, and again, looking around our room, we, for the most part, we all look basically the same. Nobody in here is radically different. Even if some people might be like, you know what, I don't dress like most people. From an outsider perspective, we all basically have same kind of shoes on and shirts on and pants or shorts because you still think it's summer. Hang on to the dream that it's going to be warm. But we don't have anybody dressed in robes today, right? We really don't. So we might have some like subtle nuances, the differences in our attire. But I'm not seeing too many like historical, ancestral, tribal, cultural attire in here today. What I'm seeing is some kind of global, cultural, homogenized attire that we've given up whatever it was that defined me as Irish or German or Polish or Cree, and we're not wearing those clothings. Instead, we have a hoodie. And on the hoodie, we have a brand of some company that maybe we feel some loyalty towards. So things are changing. Attire's changing. Role modeling's changing. We have global role models now. We can be infected by global role models, both for the good and for the bad, through things like pop culture. So we don't look towards, just a small pocket of people for role models. We have, nearly 8 billion role models to choose from. And that can rapidly change who we are. Linguistic identity is so important to cultural and collective identity that we have a francophone community within Quebec, the Quebecois, the francophones, that are so committed to defending their language because they believe if they lose their language, they'll lose their culture, they'll lose their distinctiveness, that they've passed laws that take away the ability for non-francophones to communicate in English. For example, in their signage, they have something called Bill 101. And if I had a pub in Montreal called McBride's Pub, and I want to have a menu in English or in Gaelic or Celtic, they would say, no, you have to speak French first. Your waiter, your waitress has to come to the customers and address them in French first, even though it's in English or an Irish pub. You know, to get the authentic experience, you wouldn't think that it would be French, but because you're in the Belle Province, because we have to protect our language, we are going to force you to address your clients in French first. And that's because they feel vulnerable. They feel that their language must be defended. What we are seeing is pop culture, a global pop culture. You can, travel the world, and there's things that are happening in pop culture that people are aware of in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas. So there is emerging a global culture, and it's connected to pop culture. What is popular? And sometimes pop culture can be silly things like, let's stack some milk crates up and walk up them. And when you do that, you fall, and then you bruise up your leg like that because it's stupid. You shouldn't do it. Don't do it. It's not as cool as doing 22 push-ups. That's probably a good thing. Or dumping water over your head. But we have all these little things, these moments that define who we are that really are global. Within that global arena, we have transnational corporations, big companies like Disney that have enormous influence, maybe more than our parents and our church and our ancestors have on defining who we are. You watch the movie Up and you're like, oh man, this movie's getting to me, man. Like that his wife died and now he's like gonna float away or whatever. Or you watch Wall-E and that little robot, he's holding his own hands. He's like, Wall-E, like that hits you hard. If you watch Wall-E and that thing doesn't get you, you have a hard heart. Like you've hardened your heart. So Disney is teaching us things through their stories. They try to teach us about environmentalism through Wall-E. I think people miss that part, that we're not supposed to overconsume because, garbage dumps are still full. We have terms like cultural hybridization. When we meet others, sometimes we fuse things together. Let's have fusion cuisine, maybe Korean barbecue tacos. Man, that sounds delicious. Or maybe we're going to have Sesame Street that's broadcasted in China, in Chinese, with Chinese characters. But on a negative side, when we look at how does globalization affect your culture, we can have something called assimilation. And I am a product or a victim of assimilation, as too are many of you. And that's forever going to be on the video. So if anybody needs a textbook, go down to the book room. I believe most of you have them, and the few of them that didn't, I think we took care of that. But back to the story of assimilation, this is where you get absorbed into another culture. And again, for many levels, like linguistically, I've been absorbed into the English culture. And there are people that are trying to resist that. One of the most staining parts of Canadian history, right? Shameful parts of Canadian history is scooping children from families, putting them in residential schools, and trying to alter their culture to try to assimilate them. That is a shameful, a stain on Canada's history. That is a local story as well, because we had a residential school at Ermineskin. So assimilation is not a term that we are unfamiliar with. It'll be something to look for when we examine globalization's impact on identity. So too is marginalization. Maybe we're not going to assimilate you, but marginalization, we're going to devalue you. So we come into contact with your people and you're like, you know what? We're not going to listen to you. We're not going to be included in big decisions in government. We're going to make you live on the fringe of society. We're going to push you away. We're going to devalue you. We're going to push you to the margin of society. But there's also accommodation. This is where you meet two people and you're like, you know what? We have room for you. We don't need you to become like us. We don't need to absorb you. We don't need to push you to the side. It's not assimilation, absorption. It's not marginalization, devaluing. It's accommodation. We can make room for that. There can be RCMP officers who wear turbans. We can make room for that. That's accommodation. Integration is another term related to that, the idea of making room, having diversity. Diversity is a language word that we're going to come up with a lot. I've already mentioned homogenization. This is the sameness, global sameness. And I look around the room and I see a lot of homogenization, right? Linguistically, we're all speaking English right now. The hope behind globalization is that maybe with globalization we can revitalize. So we go to ancestry.com and we're like, oh man, let's learn about the McBride clan. You know, have we ever had anybody important in our clan? Have we ever had a king or something? No, there's been no King McBrides. But, you know, it is neat to revitalize, to try to reconnect, to say, who am I? Who are we? What is that chain that I'm a part of? We can use globalization to affirm our identity. So that's an introduction to this topic. I'm going to give you a moment now to go into the Google Classroom, go through this document, reread the notes I just went over, see if you understand them. And then in about 10 minutes, 12 minutes, we're going to start looking at some sources together and seeing if we can see the language in the sources. Because you're not being tested on can you memorize what these words mean. We want you to be able to look at people's sources, which is their way of communicating. This is what I think about globalization. Here, I drew a cartoon. And it's either celebrating or challenging globalization. And I want you to be able to look into those cartoons. Look into people's quotes and photographs and say, oh, they're celebrating globalization because they're showing how it has created some benefits, or they're challenging it because it's showing the flaws and how it hurts our identity. So that's where we're headed next.